Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences and QUT webinar, which happens every month. Twice a year, the Academy and QUT collaborate on doing one of these data science in the news events. And with the Academy, we have a rather broader range of people we can pull in to the discussion, issues of social impact or special public interest. And this event will in fact be on YouTube in due course. And my name is Roly, Sussex. I am an Emeritus Professor of Applied Language Studies from the University of Queensland, and I specialise in the use of language in everyday life, including English in Australia, intercultural communication, and the language of pain. I'm your moderator for today, and today's topic is hate speech. It's currently a very major issue in Australia and overseas, especially, but not only in schools, because it affects the web, public policy, education, psychology. But schools is one of the areas where bullying has become very prominent. A recent report noted in 1 year in Australia, 550,000 bullies and 45 million incidents. And that is without even counting the digital. And there are some dreadful outcomes. Madonna King, a Brisbane-based journalist and public commentator, did a piece yesterday called "A Phone, a Click, an Image, a Bully," and just like that, another precious child's life is lost. And I'm afraid this does happen. The word hate in hate speech is not a nice word. It lines up with detest, dislike, abhor, abomination, and despise. But there is a sense in which the word hate validates the speaker. You can say, I hate violence. Whereas, in fact, what we're on about is something which is downright nasty. And so the word vilification is going to be very frequent in today's discussion. It comes from the Latin word vilis, which means of little value. And so vilification is belittling someone in a nasty way, to reduce their value in their country, their ideology, their institution, or the individual, and in the eyes of anyone who reads. It's nasty, vindictive, destructive, and dangerous. And that's where we start our discussion. And it's actually a very toxic issue as well, because there are 5.6 billion users of the web in the world. That's about 2/3 of the world's population. And the outreach of this stuff is really scary. Today's format, we've got 4 leading scholars, whom I will introduce as they speak, specialists in different aspects of vilification and vilification language. They'll make an initial statement each, and then we have discussion and questions and a wrap up at the end. If you want to submit a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use that. And if anyone is concerned by the material we're dealing with today, look for the e-Safety Commissioner on the web or the Lifeline number, which is 131114. That's 131114. So let's get going. Our first speaker is Associate Professor Kath Gelber from the University of Queensland, Professor of Politics and Public Policy, and her research is in the freedom of speech and the regulation of public discourse. Kath.
Thanks, Roly, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm going to give an overview about what hate speech is and how it harms and who can be harmed by it, and then talk a little bit about some recent developments in Australia to try and tackle the problem. So starting with a definition, Roly's introduction was very interesting, and in fact the name hate speech is actually a pretty poor name for the phenomenon we're talking about, because it implies that the key characteristic of the speech we're talking about is that it's motivated by hate, by enmity, by an emotion. And actually that's not how hate speech is understood in the literature, and that's why in Australia the term vilification is preferred. In the literature, hate speech is defined as a harmful type of speech. It is defined, generally speaking, as speech that is public, so the state doesn't seek to intervene in private conversations. And for it to constitute hate speech and therefore to be harmful as opposed to offensive or unpleasant, it needs to be directed at a member of a systemically disadvantaged group in the context within which the hate speech occurs. And the speech itself interpolates structural inequality into that context by, for example, ranking the targets as inferior, legitimating discrimination against them, or depriving them of powers. In that sense, hate speech is both a reflection of and perpetuates systemic discrimination in the context in which it occurs. This means that hate speech is actually a form of discrimination. It's a form of discrimination that happens through words, and it's just as discriminatory and just as harmful as, for example, denying somebody a job on the ground of their race, or those kinds of more, or housing, for example, those kinds of more overt forms of discrimination. It marginalises and it excludes its targets, and it is therefore harmful. Now, having given you that definition, which is used in a quite widespread way internationally within the community, I also acknowledge, of course, that there are vast differences in definitions, and in particular, vast differences in legal definitions of hate speech around the world. Many countries that regulate hate speech around the world do so exclusively by using the criminal law. And by definition, that means that the hate speech that you can respond to in the law is of the most egregious category, because obviously if somebody has the threat or the prospect of being jailed over their speech, then the speech has to be really significant, and so it's the most egregious forms that tend to be captured. Bill's going to talk more about Australia's approach, so I won't go more into Australia's approach. Here, I just wanted to acknowledge that there are vast differences in the definitions. Sometimes it's treated as a public order provision. Many provisions really try to get at the heart of the matter, which is the discriminatory nature of the harm that is incurred through hate speech. So who is capable of being harmed in this way? Members or perceived members of systemically disadvantaged groups in the context. And who is capable of harming? So that's a really interesting thing. The literature says that you need the requisite authority to be capable of harming, but we don't want to understand authority too narrowly. So, of course, there are official ways in which you can accumulate authority. You can be a police officer, you can be a politician, you can be a teacher, those kinds of things. But when we understand hate speech as a form of systemic discrimination, it's also possible for regular bystanders and regular folk to acquire authority from the context in which that hate speech occurs. So in a context in which racism is real, people who seek to perpetuate racism can informally derive that authority from the fact that racism exists in that context. So that's kind of who can be harmed, how they can be harmed, and those sorts of things. There's been a very wide recognition internationally of the scale of the problem. Certainly the online environment, as we will discuss today, has rendered this problem more pressing than ever and also more ubiquitous than ever. There's been a number of significant developments in Australia recently trying to combat the harms of hate speech online and other types of hate speech. For example, the Commonwealth, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria within the last 12 months have enacted specific legislation to prohibit symbols of the Nazi regime and display, and in the Commonwealth's case, also trade in Nazi symbols and other symbols of extremism and terrorism. So there's been some new legislative developments in the last little while, as well as, of course, Senate inquiries and Australian human rights. There's currently an Australian Human Rights Commission inquiry into racism. There's also been a flurry of new developments recently. The federal government, by way of example, just last week or the week before, released a hate crimes bill. This is the product of many years of public discussion around which initially happened around religious freedom and the need for a religious discrimination framework. The government was not able to produce a religious discrimination framework because they couldn't get agreement. So they promised instead to prohibit the worst excesses of hate speech. And what they've released now is actually called a hate crimes bill. It's a bit messy. I can talk about it, but essentially it's created a new offence for directly threatening the use of force or violence against a group or a member of a group. Remember, it's a criminal penalty. So this is an amendment to the criminal code, the Commonwealth Criminal Code. So that's currently still a bill. It hasn't been enacted, but that's one of the things that the federal government has proposed. The federal government has also recently proposed the criminalisation of doxing, which is the malicious release of personal data online. and they have increased the penalty where a person is targeted on the basis of race, religion, sex, sexuality, gender identity, intersex status, disability, or national or ethnic origin. So pulling all of those categories out of existing anti-discrimination law and providing a worse penalty for doxing if it's done on one of those bases. And interestingly, the research into, there's of course a whole variety of harms that can happen in the online sphere, not all of which are hate speech, but research does show that there's a strong intersection between somebody being vulnerable to hate speech online and somebody being vulnerable to other types of harm online, including doxing. So you're more likely to be subjected to doxing if you're also vulnerable to being targeted for hate speech online. And then, of course, there's a new bill that the federal government also has been working on for a couple of years to try and combat misinformation and disinformation, which imposes greater transparency obligations on the platforms and requires them to manage the risk of this in a more coherent manner. So there's been a flurry of lawmaking in Australia. There's also been a flurry of lawmaking internationally, and the scale of the problem is huge, and it's really challenging to think through how we might be able to move forward on this issue. Thanks, Roly.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Bill Swannie. He's from the Australian Catholic University, and he's a law-focused scholar with a focus on federal racist anti-vilification laws. Bill.
Thank you, Roly. And I agree with the comments made earlier that in Australia, the term more commonly used is vilification, and hate speech tends to be the term that's used in American law, which is infiltrating, of course, socially and politically. That language is being used more commonly in Australia as well. I will focus on the Racial Discrimination Act provisions, and it's worth noting that these provisions apply only to one type of vilification, and that is racial vilification. And I agree with the comments made by Kath that we can think about vilification law as sort of a branch of anti-discrimination law, and the Racial Discrimination Act provisions actually contain a prohibition on racial discrimination on the one hand, but it also contains prohibitions on racial vilification in completely separate provisions. And we know that in anti-discrimination law, it's based around the grounds or the attributes of discrimination. And as I mentioned before, the Racial Discrimination Act provisions only deal with the ground of race, and the conduct is only prohibited when it's done on the ground of race. The point that's worth making about the Racial Discrimination Act provisions is these are purely civil provisions. They enable a person who's targeted by vilification to commence proceedings and to seek legal redress for the conduct, and only members of the target group may commence proceedings. There are criminal provisions contained in anti-vilification laws, but these criminal provisions are much less used than the civil provisions. And with the civil provisions, of course, there's no criminal consequences. The civil cases are usually resolved by conciliation, and there's no possibility of going to prison or fines for breaching these civil provisions. With the Racial Discrimination Act provisions, there are two sections that I'll talk about that relate to vilification. On the first hand, there is Section 18C, which makes it unlawful to do an act which is reasonably likely in all the circumstances to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate a person or group because of race. And then there's also Section 18D, which contains exemptions, and these exemptions operate as defences. They mean that certain conduct, when it's done reasonably and done in good faith, is immune from liability. And the exemptions in the Racial Discrimination Act largely mirror the defences which exist in defamation law, in that conduct such as making a fair report on a matter of public interest is an exemption under the Racial Discrimination Act. There's no liability for that type of conduct. With the Racial Discrimination Act provisions, these were enacted long time ago in 1994, and these provisions actually come out of three very significant government reports which were made in the 1 or 2 years preceding the enactment of the provisions. Firstly, there was the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. There was the Law Reform Commission report into multiculturalism and the law. And then finally, there was the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission report into racist violence. It's also worth noting that the Racial Discrimination Act provisions are also based in part on Australia's obligations under the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Kath mentioned before about federal inquiries recently in terms of anti-vilification law. So in 2016, there was a joint parliamentary committee inquiry into the Racial Discrimination Act provisions. And the terms of the inquiry were to inquire into whether these provisions imposed unreasonable restrictions on freedom of speech and whether the provisions should be reformed. And the terms of reference focus very closely on this concern about trivial or vexatious complaints and about the time and the expense taken to resolve these types of complaints. The federal inquiry led to a very divided report, and the substantive provisions, Section 18C and Section 18D, were not amended. But what is interesting and I think significant coming out of this inquiry was that many members of culturally and linguistically diverse groups gave compelling evidence about the importance of these provisions and the importance of legal protections that they provided for members of vulnerable communities. I want to move now to talking about Victorian anti-vilification laws, which are very different to the federal laws. The difference with the Victorian laws is that they're based on what's called an incitement model of vilification. So to breach these laws, the conduct must incite hatred against, severe revulsion for, or contempt or severe ridicule of a person or group. So these laws focus on the impact of the conduct on a third person rather than the impact directly on members of the target group. And scholars have described this as the difference between direct or constitutive harms on the one hand and indirect or consequential harms on the other. And I will share my screen briefly to bring up an image just to illustrate the difference between these two types of laws. So on the left side, you'll see the Victorian laws, which are based on the incitement model. And then on the right side, you'll see the Racial Discrimination Act provisions, which are based on what's called a harm-based model. So the Victorian provisions are very much focused on the impact of conduct on an audience, but the Racial Discrimination Act provisions are focused on the impact of conduct directly on members of the target group. So going back to the Victorian inquiry, the main recommendation coming out of the Victorian inquiry was for the legislation to be amended to focus more on the direct harms to victims rather than to focus on the incitement aspect. The incitement aspect is more about preventing public disorder and preventing breaches of the peace, whereas the harm-based model is about the direct harm to victims and members of the target group. So it's been recognised that the Racial Discrimination Act approach, which is victim-focused, is more appropriate than focusing on the broader goals such as promoting social cohesion or multiculturalism. It's worth noting that the Victorian provisions have not been, the recommendations made in Victoria have not been enacted yet by Victorian Parliament. However, in 2022, Parliament passed laws, firstly prohibiting the display of Nazi symbols, and then secondly prohibiting the performance of the Nazi salute. These laws are a type of anti-vilification law, but rather than focusing on all types of racial or religious vilification, these laws focus only on one particular type. I want to finish by mentioning a little bit about free speech issues, because anti-vilification laws are sometimes tied very closely with discussion about free speech. Firstly, our ideas about free speech come very much from the United States, and particularly from the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment. Australia, on the other hand, is a very different political culture and very different history to the United States. Australia, of course, has no express protection of free speech. And in the US, the discussion of free speech tends to privilege this idea that the state shouldn't be involved in regulating speech, and that idea that the state shouldn't be involved tends to trump all other considerations. And it means, for example, in the United States, that it's very difficult for laws to be passed banning very harmful conduct, which would be perfectly which governments could ban in Australia. The second point that I'll make about free speech is that the Australian provisions primarily are civil provisions. They impose civil remedies such as compensation, sometimes an apology or a correction. They aren't criminal laws, which would entail fines and jail time. So I would argue that the stakes are much lower in terms of the consequence of breaching these laws. And the final point to make about free speech is that free speech is actually built into the anti-vilification laws that I've been discussing, in that there are exemptions which cover a broad range of political and public interest discussions. So these defences are at least as broad as the defences in defamation. And given the seriousness of the harms of racial vilification, it's often the case that the exemptions will mean that conduct may be harmful, but they are in fact immune from liability because they fall under an exemption in existing laws. Thank you, Roly.
Thank you, Bill. You reminded me that I had an Italian uncle who became an Australian citizen, but before he did so, he was called a refo and a bolt and a wop and all sorts of things. That sort of language has largely vanished from everyday use in Australia, and I think we've grown up very much for the better. Our next speaker is Distinguished Professor Jean Burgess from QUT. She is Professor of Digital Media in the Digital Media Research Centre and School of Communication, and her research focuses on the social implications of digital media technologies, platforms, and cultures. Jean.
Thanks, Roly. Hi, everyone. Even though it's a webinar, I just want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the traditional First Nations owners of the lands where QT and UQ now stand, and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. Hate speech has been a presence on the internet since the very beginning, simply because of the ease of self-publishing, which gave us many other wonderful things, recipes, crafting sites, all sorts of things. A range of neo-Nazi and white supremacy groups have produced and maintained their own websites, news groups, and bulletin boards and online communities ever since the 1990s. Historically, keeping these sites live was simply a matter of finding a libertarian or simply disinterested hosting provider sufficiently immune to public and regulatory pressure, a task that has become harder, but is still not impossible, unfortunately. As the web's become more populated, online communities, whether they were about crafting or pet care or photography or whatever, all had to develop their own ways of managing harmful conduct, including hate speech. This was usually done via peer-to-peer community management, and of course, it was never without deliberation, conflict, and rulemaking. The dominance of major social media platforms from the late 2000s has placed much more power and control in every way in the hands of the platform companies, including the power and control over governing speech, expression, interpersonal communication. They've effectively needed to become, as Tarleton Gillespie puts it in his 2018 book of the same name, the custodians of the internet. These days, the governance and practical management of harmful behaviour, including hate speech, generally falls under the umbrella of the trust and safety functions within social media companies. And the rules governing and encoding these policies are included variously within terms of service, codes of conduct, or usually you can find them expressed as community guidelines. It's useful to remember here that as central players in what are often called multi-sided markets, platforms have to balance the sort of conflicting interests of multiple stakeholders in order to continue to exist and make huge profits. And there are sort of four major competing drivers here that impact on how they deal with the problem of hate speech, vilification, or hateful conduct, as they would call it. They are user engagement, brand safety, so-called, public legitimacy, and then the risk of weaponization of anti-hate speech policies. So first, user engagement. Platforms need users to spend all their time and attention on them. In their desire for global dominance, they want as large and a diverse a user base as possible. So at least in theory, they want everyone to feel welcome. Secondly, they need to ensure their spaces are safe for the brands that advertise to these users. This means, particularly for large, lucrative global brands, they must avoid having ads appear next to racist or misogynistic content, while also ensuring there's enough user engagement for advertisers to reach their desired, perhaps niche audiences. Public legitimacy, especially in the case of publicly traded platform companies with shareholders and boards and so on, they need to maintain you know, a sense of public legitimacy, or the social license to operate, as it's often called in business schools. This involves balancing a primarily, as we've heard, US-centric idea of free speech with the varied demands of governments around the world, some of whom would ban racism, others of whom would ban LGBTQ expression, while others would ban critique the state itself. And finally, preventing weaponization. So one of the generic risks in regulating and policing hate speech or vilification is that legitimate counter speech and minority expression might be inhibited. This risk is even more difficult to manage when groups of users coordinate to deliberately weaponize mechanisms designed to prevent hate speech and harassment, which are quasi-legal but outside the formal legal system. So, for example, on platforms, feminists are often reported for hate speech against men. First Nations people are often reported for hateful conduct against white Australians, for racial vilification, in fact. So how are these competing drivers dealt with in practice? Well, various forms of what's commonly called harmful conduct are managed through an interlocking set of policies and protocols. All the major platforms use both proactive and reactive content moderation and behavioural management. It might be in response to user complaints, or it might be semi-automated or rules-based. It might involve the removal of posts, making those posts just a bit less visible, or suspending and even banning users. Transparency and the right to appeal are very uneven across platforms and within different content categories and for different communities. Meta's oversight board has been a novel attempt to introduce a sort of semi-independent, quasi-legal review of their content moderation and governance practices, and that's been quite interesting, but controversial as well. Hate-filled accounts can and have been banned from the major platforms because of hate speech, harassment, and incitement to violence. These include known neo-Nazis, who I will not name, former US President Donald Trump, I guess that's on a bingo card somewhere for this webinar, and the infamous misogynist Andrew Tate, who's caused so much problem in Australian schools and whose Twitter account was reinstated in 2022 by Elon Musk, also probably on the bingo card. Platform governance policies and protocols have become far more sophisticated over time, usually, though, in response to external shocks and public controversies rather than internal reflection. To the platform's credit, in some cases, there's significant nuance to their policies around these issues these days, you know, after 10, 15 years of this. Arguably, perhaps more than in some of our current and proposed legislation, in fact. For example, Meta explicitly carves out exceptions for minority or traditionally marginalised people's counter-speech in its content moderation rules. However, both the letter of the law and its enforcement vary quite significantly across platforms, especially now that Twitter's in the hands of Elon Musk. He's reinstated dangerous far-right influencers, eviscerated the platform's trust and safety team, and is reportedly planning to remove the ability for users to fully block accounts, posing major risks for things like doxing and harassment. In our paper, Safety for Whom, in the Social Media and Society Journal, Rosalie Gillett, Zara Stardust and I analysed the newsroom posts and announcements made about safety and harm by major platforms. And we found that in the main, these new policies and solutions, as I've said, have emerged in response to controversies. And generally, they don't really distinguish hate speech or vilification from interpersonal harassment and abuse of a private nature, or the deliberate distribution of misinformation. And we can see this same dynamic creeping into the proposed misinformation and disinformation bill that the Australian government is currently proposing, where misinformation is of concern if it leads to harms. And those harms can also be related to hate speech, vilification, discrimination, and so on. When they do relate specifically to hate speech, they're much more likely to be associated with issues that we can sort of all agree are bad, like racism, particularly anti-Semitism, and far less frequently the examples are related to misogyny, homophobia, or transphobia. So there's an alignment with particular set of agreed Western values and an avoidance of the kinds of debates that we might otherwise really need to have. And the final point I'll make for now is just that there's a structurally symbiotic relationship between social media and traditional media. Subtly harmful stereotypes and outright hate campaigns are given life and sustained via their mutual reinforcement across both mainstream media and social media platforms. And any strategies to counter the problem of hate speech online really need to be vigilant about avoiding amplification while surfacing the evolving forms hate speech takes. And importantly, measuring and evaluating platform responses to them against the experiences of affected communities. So, perhaps self-interestedly, this is why alongside government-led requirements for transparency and reporting, we really need continued independent research and observation of what platforms actually do and how real people and communities are impacted by what they do. I'll leave it there for now, Roly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Oh, so much to talk about. Our next speaker is Nicole Shackleton from RMIT in Melbourne. She's a lecturer in the College of Business and Law, and she's a socio-legal researcher who focuses on gender and sex, technology, and regulation. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you so much, Roly, for having me. And it's a pleasure today to join this conversation about hate speech, a topic I'm very passionate about, and to be joined on a panel with such esteemed colleagues. In my brief talk today, I'm going to be focusing on how hate speech manifests against women, using some examples from interviews that I conducted as part of my PhD research. And I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I work as a lecturer at RMIT, the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and any First Nations people here today. I'm going to use some slides today, but before I do, I always like to give a brief language warning. I'm quoting some examples of hate speech on my slides that were discussed by interview participants, and they're cited with any redaction of explicit sexual or violent language. This is an intentional decision by me to quote these experiences verbatim in order to adequately convey the nature and force of their experiences of gendered hate speech online, and to give the audience a sense of the embodied and visceral impact of hate speech on participants. And I'll bring up those slides now. So, apologies. This first slide here almost perfectly captures the phenomenon of gendered hate speech that I investigated in my thesis. This is a story told to me by Julia, a journalist and commentator who I interviewed for my PhD research. She's quoted on this slide telling a story about what happened to her during public and political debate on law reform that was a change to federal voting laws. And in this quote, Julia describes herself and a colleague, a journalist who was a man. They decided to collaborate on separate pieces commenting on the proposed legal change. Their commentary pieces were published in different newspapers, but ultimately they made the same arguments and were using the same evidence. Following the publication of the piece, they were both critiqued for their commentary. And while Julia's male colleague received correspondence which politely disagreed with them, Julia, in comparison, was threatened with graphic violence and rape, attacked for her looks and sexualized, and her intelligence was belittled. And you can see this example on the slide, which I'll let you read. Julia's story was not unique and was one of many experiences that was told to me during interviews for this project. What this story demonstrates is that often women are targeted by gendered hate speech not because of what they say, but simply because they are a woman speaking publicly or occupying public space. It also demonstrates that gendered hate speech does not occur in isolation, and both Kath and Bill made this point. This type of hate speech, whether it be against women or against people of colour, is part of a collective social problem regarding equality and women's equality and safety, and a general misogynistic attitude towards women that exists in society and in politics in Australia. There are many facets of the problem of gendered hate speech, and I really have to attempt to summarize this incredibly complex and wide-ranging issues into a couple of minutes. While gendered hate speech, and I am using the term hate speech, I won't go into why, because I won't go into it in detail, but generally I use the term hate speech because I'm interested, and in my research was focused on it as a phenomenon, not just as a legal concept. But while it can be directed towards any women or a women in general, there are particular groups that are more likely to be targeted by this type of speech. Of course, this is about intersectionality. So characteristics such as race, sexuality, disability, and religion increase the chance that a woman might be targeted. However, there's also research, and this was demonstrated and supported by my own PhD, was that women who step out of traditional gender roles, who do not conform to traditional ideas of femininity and beauty standards, and who assert their right to occupy and participate in public spaces or inhibit positions of power, are far more likely to be targeted by gendered hate speech. And this explains why, or helps explain why women such as politicians, journalists, athletes, us as academics as well as activists who are in the public and who are viewed by the public are more likely to be subjected to gendered hate speech at higher rates than the general population. This is exemplified by the quote on the slide, which is from Charlotte, who interviewed trolls as part of her own work. Charlotte, interviews with trolls argued that, yes, this is essentially what trolls are attempting to do. These online trolls, who are mostly women, mostly men, are actively targeting women because they feel that their rightful place at the top of the food chain is being threatened. And therefore, they're trying to threaten people to keep them back or put them back in their place. Kath talked about a lot of the harms that can be caused by hate speech. And again, this is exemplified in the slide, another quote from Charlotte. The experience of participants, not only are we talking about emotional, physiological, and mental harms, but there really is a connection between online hate speech and how it results in embodied fear and harm. Charlotte uses the word omnipresent threats that make you feel like you cannot live a good life and you cannot have a job and you cannot be free in the world to go about your business because you're scared all the time. This demonstrates that this online speech has real, visceral, and embodied impacts offline. Finally, I'll just quickly talk about the role that the law has played in Australia. So despite the fact that gendered hate speech causes personal harms, harms democratic participation, it's often ignored in law, and accordingly, women's experiences are just discredited frequently. This meant that many of the participants I spoke about are broadly in support of vilification reforms, reform to vilification laws, so the laws that are currently on the table in Victoria, although we haven't seen the bill yet, as well as any additional potential reforms to prohibit gendered hate speech online. This is also because there's a recognition that these laws can be symbolic, and Bill talked about this. Here's a quote from Akshaya where they talk about the fact that they're glad to have lived in an era in Australia where they had the Racial Discrimination Act because it demonstrated that there was a line that couldn't be crossed. However, we need more than laws. To effectively deal with hate speech against women, we need to take on this type of approach, that Alan talks about, where we need to have new laws, we need to train the people that enforce it, we need to have more enforcement, we need to educate. And overall, we need to have an all-rounded approach to the issue so we can address sexist attitudes and behaviour towards women in politics, society, and the media. And without such a well-rounded approach, it's unlikely we will see gendered hate speech against women reduce at any time soon. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Roly.
Thank you, Nicole. We've now got about 15 minutes for discussions between members of the panel, but also to pick up questions. We've got one in the Q&A about safety and well-being. But I thought we might start with this terrible problem about changing criteria of acceptable behavior, because they've changed during my lifetime enormously. I'm just, for example, gendered pronouns for one thing. But on top of that, I think across countries, there are different jurisdictions that have different values. In America, certain states are banning books at the moment, others are not. And when you travel to, say, Thailand, you are confronted with the idea that anyone who speaks disrespectfully of the king, because of the rule of lèse-majesté, can end up in prison, something which is not found in most other countries. So I think we've got a problem of multiple criteria working. Would anyone from the panel like to have a crack at that? Kath.
Yes, thanks, Roly. So the interesting thing, assumption underlying your question, and I think it's absolutely right, is that things do change. And that's in and of itself is useful, because the number of people, when you talk about really embedded, difficult social problems like this, a lot of people will say, oh, it'll never change. That's completely wrong, of course. Things can change and do change. And through the second half of the 20th century, there were enormous gains made in human rights and in the public's understanding of what was required, and it also into the first 24 years so far of the 21st century. But what we're witnessing, I think, right now globally is a pushback. And it relates to what Nicole's slide said about they're scared of losing their place in the hierarchy. So and I think even our former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said something about, well, gender equality is fine as long as it doesn't take anything away from men. So equality does take things away from people who currently have privilege. It does, and it will, and it should. But that doesn't mean that anyone's better off. In fact, everybody in society, in my humble opinion, is better off when we have more equality and less discrimination, because it means that our society can function at its optimal level in order to solve the pressing, humongous problems that we're facing. And for those problems, for us to have any hope of solving those problems, we need to be able to draw on the lived experience and the opinions and the views of as broad a range of citizens as possible, because we know when we don't do that, we get the solutions wrong. So I think that equality helps everybody because it helps us socially, but I also think that we're in a particular global moment where there is a pushback against some of those gains. At the same time, we're also in a moment that Jean would be able to talk to better than I, where it's hard to engage in real dialogue because the online environment doesn't encourage real dialogue. It encourages very short bursts of commentary. It encourages things that are emotive. It encourages easy sort of one-sentence solutions to very, very complex problems. It doesn't encourage dialogue. So if we could fundamentally transform that system, that sphere, so that it encouraged dialogue instead of did what it's doing now, which is encouraging virtue signalling and hatred and emotions and fear and anger and blocking, then maybe we'd get somewhere.
Yeah, the notion of real dialogue is terribly hard. And I mean, you see people at a coffee shop, they're all sitting around a table and all poking away at their phones. No one is engaging eye contact with anyone else. And I think our habit of longer dialogue has been radically cut back. Thank you for that thought, Kath. Because whereas we used to have discussions lasting several hours, we now tend to communicate in zingers, which is pretty pathetic when you get to it. Other members
could I respond to unfortunately, in response to what Kath said, I think I think that characterization of algorithms rewarding anger and emotion and et cetera, I think that's actually a little out of date. And in fact, the major platforms have been under so much pressure about online discord that they're doing everything they can, in fact, to inhibit users from saying anything at all. Most of the algorithms on Instagram and on Facebook encourage a little more than little heart emojis on influencer content or back to school photos, as cute as they are. And the business model is shifting, in fact, away from any kind of discussion or discourse and away to and towards just consumption and becoming users of the Gen AI tools that they've trained on all of our data. And so this idea that this idea of civility, in fact, has had a radically dampening effect, I think, on the very kind of infrastructures that we would need to have the kind of dialogue and deliberative discussions and respectful debates that we might otherwise want to have, with the exception of Twitter, which just is an absolute trash fire and rewards the very worst of human behavior. So yeah, I think things are even more in a crisis than they were perhaps 5 years ago in this sense.
But Jean, then what do we do with these teenagers who are busy vilifying each other, and where some of them, and there are data that young men are much more prone to self-harm and young women are much more prone to, I think it's round the right way, to suicide. How can one possibly reach into that and re-establish civility?
I just put civility to one side. Because I think civility as a value encourages a lot of people to shut up who might have something to say. Nicole's nodding, and I think I know why. But I think my colleagues who are experts in working with young people and digital media would say talk to them about it. And one thing that is not the answer is trying to introduce a new era of prohibition or forced abstinence. I think, and that's, well, we might talk about the safety issue, but I think there's a lot of kind of patronizing and dismissal of their experiences. And I think we'd start by talking to them.
Yeah, we do in fact have a Q&A question about safety from Michael, who said that, Jean, you were talking about focus on safety, and asks whether safety is inconsistent with or somehow inclusive of well-being. So how do safety and well-being sit together? Jean, you go first, and then some of the others.
I'll go first very briefly. And yeah, I really respect the work that the E-Safety Commissioner does. I'll say that, but I think the term safety as an umbrella concept, or even trust and safety, is hugely problematic. Historically, it's tended to be used to keep women at home, or to put black men in jail for being threatening to nice white women. So I have a lot of problems with the concept of safety. I think it's an important part of and an enabler of well-being, the ability to participate fully in public life or in civic life in whatever way, but I don't think it's a very good top-level concept at all.
Yeah. Nicole, some of your data are among the rawest that I've seen for quite a while. How does safety sit with, or how can you push back against that sort of stuff?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Roly. Apologies for the rawness of it. That first slide is the opening slide of my PhD and will probably be the opening slide of the book that comes from it. And there is a reason for that, because it really does encapsulate the visceral and embodied impact of how that gendered abuse of women affects them, and also the way that it just comes because they are women. And I think that the fact that this occurs regardless of what you are saying, merely because you are in the public space, makes the issue of safety very difficult, because for safety, police have traditionally, and I know it still occurs, although I do believe there's a lot of training, when this was starting to be reported, police told women to just get off their phones and get off the internet. And so what needs to be talking about is, how do we make these spaces, accessible? How do we make them a place where you can engage in ways that are productive, rather than perhaps talking about safety? And I think safety leads to, well, there's a risk, and all we need to do is deal with the risk. And when we deal with risk, we remove benefit. And for example, we see things like, let's ban any kind of, let's credit cards, for example, stopped supporting I can't remember the name of it now, but essentially it was a site where a lot of sex workers went to be online, and that was a very safe place for them to be. And then by banning that space, we've stopped this benefit because all we've thought about is risk. And so really the key is we have to rethink these things. And I don't want to take up too much time, but there was a great question from Eleanor about hate speech between women. And that is, there's two things there. Just because you're a woman, it doesn't mean that you don't make a racist or racist vilification or homophobic vilification against another woman who, because they're black or because they're gay. It also doesn't mean that you don't make patriarchal and sexist and, there was lots of evidence of women using hate speech against other women to put them back in their place. And when you create competition, and that's part of the patriarchy, is forcing women to compete against one another, then you continue to have these things being reinforced as well. So I'll stop talking.
Yeah. Bill, a lot of the legislation that you were talking about tends to be rather punitive. Is there a way in which it can proactively promote more civil behaviour?
Oh, I'm not sure that I'd agree that it's punitive. I mentioned, these are civil laws, and most of the cases are actually resolved through conciliation. So I think around 97% never reach a court or tribunal. So they're actually resolved by conciliation. They're resolved by discussion between the people involved. And I think the criminal laws are something else, and they arguably are punitive and they should be punitive. But the civil laws are something different, and the process is not punitive. Like, it is about reconciling the parties in dispute, and the outcomes are quite mild in terms of it could be resolved through an apology or something like that. And I would argue that process itself actually does encourage a more conciliatory approach, in that if there are comments which are made which are based on misunderstanding or those sort of things, then the conciliation process itself can feed into that educative function. And I think the civil laws perform a really important role in terms of helping to educate both parties or all parties to a dispute about why that conduct is prohibited by laws. So there is an educational purpose actually built into the processes that we have already.
Yeah, I must say that the factor missing from a lot of all of this is intention, because some people do unintentionally cross the line, and the conciliation thing is actually a very important part of it. Before we get to later statements, Kath, I want to put one to you that's come up in the Q&A. What do you think universities can do to effectively educate students on recognising and addressing hate speech or vilification?
Well, I think on this question, universities are much like the rest of civil society. There's obviously a responsibility on everybody to understand and recognise and address vilification. Universities have been under the spotlight for the last few years, a number of years ago, due to the then federal government's commencement of a review into the status of free speech on Australian universities, subject to the accusation that universities were insufficiently protecting free speech. Recently, that's kind of turned around completely, and now universities are being accused of insufficiently addressing anti-Semitism in particular, and other forms of racism on campuses. All of those things, I absolutely recognise the increase in anti-Semitism and other forms of racism in the context of a very heightened global political environment, and universities have an active responsibility to create an environment within which their core mission can work. And their core mission is the creation and dissemination of new knowledge. So we absolutely have to provide environments within which research can take place and within which our staff and our students feel safe. Taking on board what people said about safety. So yes, we have an obligation to do that. We have an obligation to respond to events on campus that are discriminatory and vilifying, but we also have an educative role to play, because we absolutely have to maintain the environment that's conducive to our central mission. So all of the policies that exist, including the Higher Education Support Act and the French Model Code, talk about the reasonable and proportionate steps that universities can take I mean, it doesn't say explicitly but like vilification laws, as Bill has explained, which universities should take in order to ensure that the environments support the wellbeing and safety of staff and students and are conducive to the teaching and research that need to happen. It's a really significant responsibility on universities in terms of what happens on their own campuses.
Yeah. The clock is ticking, and I'd like to ask all of our panelists if they would have a short statement about what are the most crucial things that need to happen next. Kath, you go first.
Oh, thanks, Roly. So I think what I've said really can be summed up by saying that what hate speech does is it excludes voices from public discourse. And my view is that we need to be as inclusive as possible of voices in public discourse, and we need to be better not only at allowing and encouraging and enabling and facilitating those voices to be in public discourse, but at listening to voices with which we disagree. Obviously, there's an actionable conduct line where it turns into harm, and that's what vilification laws try to do. But on this side of that actionable harm, it's about dialogue. And so we benefit from having as many people involved in that substantively as we can.
I love the word inclusive. Thank you. Bill?
I guess what I can contribute to this discussion is like that there are different types of anti-vilification laws, and some perhaps are more effective than others. And as I mentioned before, in Australia, there's broadly speaking two main approaches. There's the harm-based model that we see in the Racial Discrimination Act, and that's in the way that it's been drafted and also the way that it's been interpreted. And then there's a very different model which is based on incitement, and that incitement-based approach is less effective. It's a very hard standard for members of target groups to establish through the legal processes. And that incitement-based model, although it's quite common in states and territories, is a less effective model, and hopefully will be replaced. And so I guess what I can contribute to this discussion is that in terms of regulating this conduct, there needs to be a clear focus on the harms to members of target groups, because that's what these laws are designed to prohibit and also to redress.
Yeah. Thank you. Jean?
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention in my little talk was the hyper-individualism of the way that platforms deal with this problem. So individual users and individual pieces of content, and of course that is mirrored in the way the law often operates as well. And just going back to that, to what Nicole was saying, well, everyone said it, that, you know, and you said it as well, Roly, that there are broader cultural dynamics and systemic issues here. And so, as I was saying, the mainstream media, Australian political establishment, what needs to happen next is they need to take a look in the mirror and think about the cultural settings in which all this takes place. We're not going to fix it by yelling at Meta or Instagram or Twitter.
Lovely. And finally, Nicole.
Thank you, Roly, and thank you, everyone. My final thoughts are essentially what I had on the last slide from Alan, is that if we're thinking about vilification in general, or vilification against women, gendered vilification specifically, is that we need an all-rounded approach. And part of that is the law. Part of it is what Jean said about not being so individual focused. We need to think about this as a collective social problem. But another part of this is, as you said, Jean, we need to demand better of the people that set the standards around racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and the list goes on. We as a society generally, whether it be politics, media, or other forms of discussion, really treat certain people very poorly, and this leads to violence, it leads to discrimination, it leads to exclusion. And, you know, there's connections with other things around, you know, conspiracy theories and these types of things. So we need to train people to recognize the connections between these things, that it doesn't happen in isolation. And when we take that well-rounded, all-rounded approach, perhaps we can start seeing real and significant change.
Thank you. We're nearly out of time. One thing that strikes me is that there is, in fact, much good in social media. Think of COVID and the way in which it kept people in touch when they were locked down at home. But this is enormously difficult and complicated, and I'm very worried that AI may even get in there and start generating a tsunami of dreadful stuff. As we've all said, there's no single silver bullet for this. It's going to be complicated. And one of the things we've done today is to try and identify some of the current raw places in the debate and to suggest some of the ways forward. And so, audience, it's over to you. The French say, "Ce n'est que le premier pas qui coûte." It's only the first step which is important. We've gone some way down that track, but there's a lot to be done. To everybody, thank you for your participation, and also my respects to the Turrbal and Niagara people on the grounds where we meet digitally today. And my thanks to the panelists for contributing so richly to a really complicated and difficult topic. Thank you, and good day to everyone.